This is something I do in my classes on a semesterly basis. I cover Lewis's Men Without Chests, and we talk about the subjectivity of beauty. I love it, Lance. You're already here. I figured this might draw people related to you. I didn't know you yourself would be here. Good to see you, Lance. Just hitting you with facts and logic. It's really funny. So we will jump right in here with, so for this live, usually I do a live where I do an office hours and everything, but this live is going to be quite different. We will look explicitly at a reading. I'm going to pull over here, and I'll spend the most of the time over here. So I'm going to put this on our stage. We're going to go line by line for this. And if you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to plop them right into the chat, and we shall get going. So this is kind of an icebreaker quote to kind of show you what we're dealing with here. So he says here, this is Lewis. We'll give you a little bit of background on Lewis, but just to jump in right here, icebreaker, he says, there are educators who, he says, have misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify young people against emotion. He says, my own experience is a bit different. Tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. And this is really the kicker here. Lewis is a masterful writer. He says the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. He says the right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. All right, so that is where we are going. Here is where we will start. Now, let me just make sure everything is in order. We look good. Good. So, we start here in chapter 1. Like I said, this is something that I often teach on, chapter 1 of a book called Abolition of Man. So, let me show you. Abolition of Man was originally a set of lectures, 3 lectures in particular. We are just looking at the first one, which is really the first chapter of this now book, Abolition of Man. Began as a series of lectures at the University of Durham in February 1943. And this was the first of that series of lectures. Now, if you wanted to go and look at the other lectures, just grab the book called Abolition of Man. Now, I teach, like I said, just on this first chapter called Men Without Chest. And it's one of those like really kind of interesting pieces. You know, what is actually going on? It's got a mysterious title and so on. And so let's just jump right in here. So he says, all right, he says, I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary school textbooks. That is why I've chosen as a starting point for these lectures a little book on English intended for boys and girls in the upper forms of schools. I do not think the author of this book, or authors, there were 2 of them, intended any harm, but, he says, I owe them, and he says, I owe them or the publisher good language for sending me a complimentary copy. I got a free copy, cool. I'm not going to lambaste them. So he finds himself in a pretty predicament. He says, I do not want to lambaste or pillory 2 modest practicing schoolmasters who are doing the best they knew. But I cannot be silent about what I think the actual tendency of their work was. I therefore am going to conceal their names. So he's going to anonymize them. He'll call them Gaius and Titius. And he's going to call their book the Green Book. He says, I promise you there's such a book and I have it on my shelves. This is actually true because Lewis, he did anonymize this. So at the time, maybe only people who had actually read it. But again, like who's going to read this? It's a elementary textbook. Really, I think in the upper forms of schools is what, yeah. So he says here, I think, yeah, the upper forms of schools. So either he says this later or maybe I just read it. Yeah. So this is like a high school textbook. So how many people are out there actually reading high school textbooks? So if you knew, you knew. But it turns out fans of C.S. Lewis found out what this book was. And you can actually find the book. The book does exist. It is called The Control of Language. And it is out of print now. But you can find it on eBay every once in a while. And it will fetch, a pretty penny because, just kind of an unintended consequence of being fans of C.S. Lewis, people kind of, it's commands a high price nowadays and it's very rare. So, all right. So he says here, all right, you might wonder, okay, well, first of all, you might wonder what the heck has Lewis got a problem with an elementary school or let's say high school textbook? What's his problem, right? Well, actually, Lewis is, you might know C.S. Lewis from his Chronicles of Narnia. You might know him from his Mere Christianity, right? He's a very famous author, but he wasn't just a children's author or popular level writer. He was, in his day job, he was a classics and literature professor at Oxford and Cambridge. So in any case, if anyone has the credentials to comment upon, educational books, on English, then that's going to be him. So let's keep going. So he says here, so what's the problem with the book? He says, in the second chapter, Gase and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall. And at this point, I ask my students, you guys know the story, right? Of course, they don't know the story. It's a little bit of a rhetorical move because he says, you guys know what I'm talking about. And of course, the audience is going to be like, sure, because you don't want to look stupid. So it's a little funny. But he says, you remember. And then he says, you remember there were two tourists present. It's funny because he says, the well-known story, you guys know what I'm talking about. But then he goes on to remind you anyway, so you don't look idiotic. It's a really interesting rhetorical move. But anyways, two tourists present. That one called it sublime in the story, and the other called it pretty. And that Coleridge, this is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. And he continues, Gase and Titius comment as follows. When the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he wasn't. He was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. All right. So let me pull this away and share a different document at this point. I've got a whiteboard, really a blackboard. So here we have a situation, right? So we have a speaker saying this is sublime, namely that the waterfall is sublime. But in reality, Gase and Titius say that that's not what he was saying. He was instead saying that I have sublime feelings. Or something like, I have in my mind feelings associated with the word sublime, okay? So just keep an eye out for this. You have a speaker saying this. Actually, first of all, let's try to figure out what in the world could sublime mean. Of course, it makes you think of, Sublime, the band, right? Sublime. Like, this is what students, even though students, like, it's been a while since Sublime was, like, were worldwide popular, they at least know, you've got the band shirts and stuff, so they're like, oh, Sublime, of course, that's going to be, I don't know what it means. So in the context, of course, if they're calling a waterfall sublime, it seems like it's going to be something beautiful, given the context. Context clues said to something beautiful. And it's, I guess, more beautiful than merely pretty, because that's the judgment that Coleridge said was disgusting, or he rejected it with disgust. So what could sublime mean? At this point, I pause. I'm like, what do you think it means? And so if you break it down, sub equals, of course, under, like a submarine, or it can mean under, beneath, or even up to. And that is going to be the meaning that we see here. And then lime, this is, it's not always this is the root word, not a suffix. So lime, it comes from the word limnus, or we see it here, we see it in the modern English word limb, and we see it in the modern English word limit. It means something like a limit or a threshold. Okay? Threshold. Okay, so up to a threshold. Okay. So what could that mean? We know that the word now literally means, right here, it means up to a certain threshold. Okay, we know what it literally means. Has that help us understand what the context? Okay, we know it has to do with beauty given the context. We know that it has to do with up to some certain threshold. And at this point, I'm like, okay, tell me more, students. What do you think? It is, again, if we look at the context, up to a certain threshold. Let's pull back and share the screen here. We know it has to do with some threshold, right? We know that the word sublime, he says, the other one called it merely pretty. Coleridge liked the first one and rejected the second one discussed. So it's going to be sublime, which means really pretty, but over more than pretty. Okay. So it means up to a threshold in this sense. What's the threshold? It would be the threshold really between the natural world and the supernatural world. It would mean that sublime is something that's so beautiful that it's almost divine. All right. It touches upon the divine and the supernatural. That's how beautiful it is. And so you can see why Coleridge rejected merely pretty with disgust. It's just not going to do the job. Okay. So, all right. So he says, let's keep going. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall. He was making a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was, I have sublime feelings, basically. And then he continues. He says, here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion, but the authors are not yet finished. Now you add, the confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually, we are only saying something about our own feelings. All right. So, again, a speaker says the waterfall is sublime, but Gaius and Titius, these authors, are saying, all he's really saying is this, sublime feelings. And that's actually pretty intuitive for many people today to think that that's all that could possibly mean, right? Because really, to say the waterfall is sublime, this is sublime, we look at that and we don't think, now to the modern mind, we don't think that that's like saying something like that is 6 feet tall. Like if we say that is 6 feet tall, we mean the thing itself, the object over there is really 6 feet tall. When we're saying the waterfall is sublime, we really don't mean that that object over here, that waterfall really is sublime, has the properties of sublimity. So this seems intuitive, but Lewis is obviously going to have a problem with this. So a little bit of flagging of what's going on here. Let me show you where he's going next. And for this, I'll use a different screen here. Right here. So where he's going next is this. Actually, let me pull that one up. Back up. So this view right here, the one that Lewis will endorse, is called value objectivism. And this one is called value relativism. Now, I know that many of you who have seen my stuff before are familiar that I did a video before on moral relativism. So let me show you what that would look like on this context. So get over there. All right, this is a new program that I'm trying. All right, so value relativism. So again, the value relativism here is the view that we are now dealing with today. But you might, of course, have heard or are very familiar yourself with the term moral relativism. How are those two related? Okay, which is which? You can think of this as like an umbrella term. All right, so value relativism would be up here. All right, and there are different things under this umbrella, one of which is certainly moral relativism, right? So anything we say about value relativism would also be true of moral relativism. It would just value relativism is just more general. But there are other, what do we mean by values? Well, One of them would be moral value or moral goodness. Another would be aesthetics or beauty. And that's another one, the next one that would go here, aesthetics. Aesthetic relativism would be another one that falls under this umbrella of value relativism. Another one would be religious relativism. And then a fourth one that Lewis discusses in this reading is political relativism, interestingly. That if there are values within political society, fix that, sorry. If there are values in a political society, those would be relative. Now, what do these all have in common? Well, take, for example, if I were to say the phrase, God loves you, right? How would that sit to your ears? God loves you. It's just imagine like you're walking, minding your business, going about your day, going grocery shopping, and you walk out and then a guy just passes by and he says, God loves you. To your ears, probably that won't sound like an objective statement. That is, it will sound like a relative statement. That's why it get housed here under value relativism often. It will sound like to your ears, it'll be like, well, that guy he's trying to be nice. That's just how he feels. Relative to him, God, it's true that God loves me. But there's no like objective fact of the matter or something like that, right? So that would fall under value relativism. That would be this religious relativism. That would be an instance of that. These other ones, of course, aesthetic relativism, you might hear things like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. All that means is that beauty is relative or it's subjective. It's just going to be according to me and my subjective values. This is beautiful and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we are quite probably most familiar with moral relativism. The idea that relative to me, this thing is morally good or morally bad, so on and so forth. Now, I've drawn the umbrella for value relativism, let's say, but you can draw the same umbrella and the same framework for value objectivism, right? So this moral relativism is just going to go under, but this whole discussion is, let's go back, is a discussion between these two, value objectivism versus value relativism. So I just said you can draw that umbrella with respect to either or, right? And then you will still have, say if you want to go talk about value objectivism, you can then talk about moral objectivism, aesthetic objectivism, religious objectivism, and so on and so forth. It would just be the same framework, just opposite, I suppose. And on that framework, it would be take, for example, this this aesthetic judgment. That would now be understood as it is here as being an objective statement that there really is a property named sublimity and that objects really can have that property. All right. So, hey, good to see you, outside. Good to see you, Nathan. I think that's all who's here. Good. All right, so let me pull away this now. I'm going to bring up our reading again. Okay, cool. All right, here we go. So that's the setup. But he says, look, before considering the actual issues raised in this momentous little paragraph design, you will remember for the upper forms of schools, we must eliminate one mere confusion in which Gaius and Titius have fallen. Even on their own view, on any conceivable view, the man who says this is sublime cannot mean I have sublime feelings. This is basically incoherent, Lewis will argue. He says, even if it were granted that such quality as sublimity were simply solely projected into things from my own emotions, let me just skip ahead. He says here, if this is sublime, no, he says right here, this is the point. The feelings which make a man call an object sublime are not sublime feelings, but feelings of veneration. So he's saying, look, even before I start to attack the philosophical view of value relativism, I have to make a clarifying point here. What Gaius and Titius have claimed is self-referentially absurd. You cannot translate, that is, this is sublime, into I have sublime feelings. The translation itself, as we saw on my whiteboard, the translation from this waterfall is sublime or this is sublime to I have sublime feelings would just be incoherent. And he explains here, he says, it would lead to obvious absurdities. It would force them, Gayes and Titius, to maintain that you are contemptible means I have contemptible feelings. In fact, your feelings are contemptible. My feelings are contemptible. What does this mean? This means that, for example, Newell Side just joined us. If I say you are hateful, that's really saying my feelings are hateful. Because again, I'm just taking the properties that I'm trying to assess on you, and really they're just a description of my own sort of mental state. And or in fact, if I go so far as to say that, oh, you're being hateful. In other words, you have hateful feelings, Newell Side. Well, that really is, according to Gayes and Titius, a translation that translates to I have hateful feelings. So I'm trying to say you have hateful feelings, but really, according to them, I'm saying I have hateful feelings. So I'm actually saying something pretty absurd and self-contradictory here, and it's not at all what I'm trying to communicate in an English language. But he says, let's just put this aside. Let's keep going. He says, and now I'm going to jump into this. It's just one point of clarity, but it's not a substantive point. He actually needs to deal with their concern. So he says, the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional statement of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. Okay, so believe those two things. One, that all statements of predicate of value. What is a predicate of value? Again, I'll come back here. Sorry. I got to get faster at this, guys. Right here. A predicate of value, again, in the English language, of course, you have your subject here, and you have your predicate here. And a predicate is predicated of the subject. Okay? It's predicated of the subject. So we're saying that a sublime is predicated of the waterfall. So when he says predicates of value, he means that if we're predicating of a subject anything of value, namely what we already said over here, right? Any of these values right here, okay? Moral, aesthetic, religious, political, and so on, okay? So that's what he's doing. Let me bring this back up. Sorry, guys. All right, so that's a predicate of value. Basically, he says, first, all sentences containing predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. That's what Gayes and Titius are teaching him. And he said, secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. Now, he goes on to say, basically here, look, they didn't come right out and say this, but it's implicit in what they said, and they never tried to protect against the extension. He says here, the pupils are left to do themselves the work of extending the same treatment, and no slightest obstacle to such an extension is placed in their way, basically. So they left themselves open to this criticism, and is certainly, this is a good, I've said this before when it comes to good advice for writing, good advice for speaking, good advice for video stuff, that you don't write in order to be understood, that you write so that you're not misunderstood. And Gayes and Titius could have used some of this advice. If perhaps option one, they intended this, and Lewis is writing his criticism. Option two, well, they didn't intend this, and Lewis is just, reading between the lines what they didn't intend. Good writing advice would have saved them to not leave open those gaps so that somebody could come in there and interpret them wrongly. But they didn't do such a thing. So he says here, the authors may or may not desire the extension. They may have never given it question 5-minute serious thought in their lives. I'm not concerned with what they desired, but with the effect their book will have on the schoolboy's mind. Okay? And he says in the same way, they have not said that judgment of values are unimportant. Their words are that we appear to be saying something very important, when in reality we're only saying something about our own feelings. And of course, he says no schoolboy will be able to resist the suggestion brought to bear upon him by that word only. And this is the important point. So he says here, I don't mean, of course, that he'll make any conscious inference from what he reads to a general philosophical theory that all values are subjective and trivial. Notice we are doing a deep dive on a philosophical theory in metaethics and in metaphysics. But remember, he says, this was for schoolboy doing his English homework. He says, the very power of Gase and Titius depends on the fact that we are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake, right? So it's a bit insidious. I don't know, and Lewis doesn't know whether they did it intentionally. But again, it doesn't matter whether they did it intentionally. It only matters the effect it has. And he says here, it's not a theory they put into his mind, but an assumption, which 10 years from now, its origin forgotten, its presence unconscious, will condition him to take one side in a controversy, which he's never recognized as a controversy at all. It kind of makes you wonder, like, is a theory they put into his mind 10 years from now, its origin forgotten, presence. It kind of makes you wonder, like, what did I uncritically swallow just as like the gospel truth 10 years ago, and now, or even my education growing up, and now I just take for granted. It's like, that's common sense. Everybody knows this, right? It's almost like, you can go back throughout history and see things, obviously like racist stuff, eugenics stuff in history that are kind of like a black mark on us, a dark stain on our reputation. But everybody was like, you just think about like racial or scientific racism, the idea that because you have a different shaped cranium, you're going to be a lesser intelligence or something like that. It is very true that many people growing up in those eras certainly just uncritically swallowed that stuff as the gospel truth and never thought at all about it. So he says that the authors themselves, I suspect, hardly know what they're doing to the boy, and he, of course, cannot know what is being done to him. So, all right. Let's keep going. All right. And remember, drop your questions in if you have any questions, and then I will periodically pop in. Yeah. Good, yeah. Okay, so New also says, addressing the ideas that we have under a critical lens is usually called deconstructionism. It's an interesting act. Well, it's one thing to be a deconstructionist, and it's quite another thing just to be merely a critical thinker who thinks critically about things and what you uncritically imbibe, right? Deconstructionism is a philosophical theory that has its own sort of motives and stuff. What I'm describing is merely being a critical thinker and a philosophical thinker who thinks about the stuff it's a good epistemologist, basically. And of course, we know that not all epistemologists are deconstructionists, so it's just not going to be the same thing. But you are right that deconstructionists do this to some degree. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. So he says, before considering the philosophical credentials of the position which Gase and Titius have adopted about value, I would like to show its practical results on the educational procedure. All right, so he's going to do two things. Notice he's going to do two things. What are those two things? Number one, this is the thing he's going to do second, but he says, number one, I'm going to consider and assess and evaluate and maybe criticize the philosophical credentials of the position. Basically, I'm going to address the actual philosophical theory that they are presupposing. That is the philosophical theory of value relativism. All right. But he says, before I do that, I'm going to do this other thing first. The second thing, which is I'd like to show its practical results on the educational procedure. All right. So just so we know, like a roadmap, what lies ahead, what he's going to do is first, I'm going to look at what happens if you teach this to children. Okay. Now, you may disagree with this, but we'll just see where he goes. All right. So he says here, in their fourth chapter, they quote a silly advertisement of a pleasure cruise, and then proceed to inoculate their pupils against the sort of writing it exhibits, right? So think, for example, of a cheesy advertisement. I always think of like military commercials, like GoArmy.com or Marines be all you can be, or few the proud of the Marines, Army be all you can be. And it always strikes me as like really cheesy and emotionally manipulative, That's what he's describing here. It's like it's a silly advertisement, So think of something like that, whatever your example would be. He says the advertisement tells us that those who buy tickets for this cruise will go across the Western Ocean, that is the Atlantic, because they're in England, where Drake of Devon sailed. This is Sir Francis Drake, adventuring after the treasures of the Indies, and bringing home themselves also a treasure of the golden hours and glowing colors. Now, he says, of this description, is a bad bit of writing. Of course, like I wouldn't know, but I trust Lewis on this because he's the expert. Again, he's the subject matter expert. Again, he is a English literature and classics scholar who taught at Oxford and Cambridge. So I don't have the skills to know whether it's a bad bit of writing. I just kind of have a feel for it, but he knows it's a bad bit of writing. He tells us that. Take his word for it. He says it's a venal, pathetic, and that is really, truly a word, pathetic. I'd never heard that word before reading this writing. It's not pathetic, pathetic. Go look that up, I suppose. A venal and pathetic exploitation of those emotions. Again, emotionally manipulated of awe and pleasure, which men feel in visiting places that have striking associations with history or legend. So he says here, if Gaius and Titius were to stick to their last, do their job, and teach their readers, as they promised to do, the art of English composition, here's what they should have done. It was their business to put this advertisement side by side with passages from great writers in which the very emotion is well expressed, and then showed where the difference lies. All right. Here's what they should have done, and here's what they did instead. All right. So here's what they should have done. They should have compared bad bit of writing, good bit of writing. And as you know, in scientific method, you want to keep the control very much the same, like and only change the independent variable very slightly, right? So you want to keep the subject matter the same. So bad bit of writing about emotional exploits or emotional experiences, good bit of writing about emotional experiences. That would have been a real nice lesson. And he says here, and then he shows his credentials and his chops here. He says they might have used Johnson's famous passage from the Western Islands. This is Samuel Johnson, or he keeps on going. It might have taken place in the Prelude, where Wordsworth describes how the antiquity of London first descended on his mind with weight and power growing under weight. I mean, that sounds good to me. I don't know, but he's saying here, if you lay beside good literature, beside the bad literature, the advertisement, and really discriminated the good from the bad, that would have been a lesson worth teaching. He said there would have been some blood and sap in it. And he says, he takes a shot at him. He says, it would have also had the merit of being a lesson in literature, a subject of which Gaius and Titius, despite their professed purpose, are uncommonly shy. Right? That's what they should have done. They didn't. Here's what they actually did. What they actually do is point out, and let me ask you this. If you're thinking about this, just think to yourself, like, could I have figured this out on my own if I didn't have Gaius and Titius here to teach me this? Like, if I saw a cheesy ad about a pleasure cruise, right? Would I have figured this out, right? Or did I need them to tell me? So here's what the luxurious motor vessel won't really sail where Sir Francis Drake did. Well, I suppose in some sense it will, because you could still go to the same islands and follow the same route, the sea route. I mean, do they mean that I won't time travel? I mean, of course I knew that before I read the ad. Okay, well, that the tourists will not have any adventures. Well, darn. I mean, that's a little depressing. I won't have any adventures. I mean, I won't have adventures like in the age of navigation, in the age of exploration adventures, but I certainly will have an adventure on my vacation or something. That the treasures they bring home will be of a purely metaphorical nature. Oh, do you mean I won't have any pirate treasure? That's a bummer. Oh, could I figure that out without their help? And that a trip to Margate might provide all the pleasure and rest they required. I could have just gone down the street instead of going on a cruise. I probably could have figured that out on my own, and yet they seem to feel the need to go out of their way to teach the schoolboy this. And he says there, and he says as much, Lewis says, all this is very true. Talents inferior to those of Gaius and Titius would have sufficed to discover it. Basically, an idiot could have told you this. An idiot could have told you this, but they felt the need to tell you anyway. He says, what they have not noticed nor cared about is that a very similar treatment could be applied to much good literature, which treats the same emotion. So here's a really interesting point. Lewis is saying, look, why are you punching down on this easy target, this little terrible, cheesy advertisement? Like, if your goal was to trash talk the emotion in it, pick a harder example, find a challenge, stop punching down on this really bad one, right? He says, what after all can the history of early British Christianity in pure reason add to the motives for piety? He says in the 18th century, whatever example he used earlier, he's referring to. Or, for example, why should Mr. Wordsworth Inn be more comfortable or the air of London more healthy just because London has existed for a long time? So on and so forth. There's no obstacle, indeed, which will prevent a critic from debunking Johnson or Wordsworth. So why didn't they pick the harder challenge? It's just kind of a throwaway comment, but he's right. And then he says this: from this passage, the schoolboy will learn about literature precisely nothing. What he will learn quickly enough, and perhaps indelibly, this means it'll leave a mark, a scar, is the belief that all emotions aroused by local association are in themselves contrary to reason and contemptible. Emotions aroused by local association, for example, local association, like a locale, a location, and there are emotions aroused by that location, right? So Sir Francis Drake, going to islands or something. For me, I think of, I've been to a lot of places. One place that I'd really like to still go to is Port Royal, Jamaica, because it used to be like a real pirate hub, right? And when I think about Port Royal, like part of the old town has fallen into the sea, and you can take a kayak over there and look down, and they're like the ruins under the water, or even like scuba dive it or snorkel it and stuff. And that would evoke, like when I think about it, even and especially if I were to go there, it would evoke so much history and legend and emotion for me, right? So that's what he's saying. He's saying this is what they're teaching them, and it will leave a mark that the students are picking up. If you have an emotion aroused by local association, that is contrary to reason. It is irrational and contemptible. It is something to be hated and repressed and pushed out. Don't listen to it because it's irrational. He says, the schoolboy will have no notion that there are actually two ways of being immune to such an advertisement, that it falls equally flat on those who are above it and below it, on the man of real sensibility and on the mere trousered ape who has never been able to conceive the Atlantic as anything more than a million tons of cold salt water. Basically, he says there are two ways to be inoculated against this advertisement, being immune to this advertisement. He says there are two men, for example, I think back to, he says, two men we offer in vain a falsely article on patriotism and honor, right? So that's probably what got me to think about like a cheesy military Go Army ad or something, or commercial or something, like real cheesy, emotionally manipulative, right? And he says there are two ways to be immune to this, actually. This will never be brought before the boy's mind, but this is just a throwaway comment for Lewis. He says, two men to whom we offer in vain and being immune to it. One is the coward, the other is the honorable, patriotic man. Why? Why would those men be immune to such a cheesy ad, right? Well, because the coward, he's going to be immune to a cheesy ad because it's going to have no effect on him, that is, because he wasn't going to go in the first place. He's a coward. He's not going to go and fight in the military. And similarly with a patriotic man, he's going to be immune to that because he was going to go anyway, right? No amount of emotional manipulation is going to make him want to go more, right? He, in other words, is his grounds for his decisions and actions are based on good virtue. And so this emotional manipulation just won't have any effect on him. Of course, none of this is brought before the schoolboy's mind. On the contrary, he's encouraged to reject the lure of the Western Ocean on the very dangerous ground, Lewis calls it dangerous, that in doing so, he will be above the temptation. He will prove himself a knowing fellow who can't be bubbled out of his cash, right? Gaius and Titius, this is the sad part, and this should be a paragraph break. So I'll read the rest of this paragraph and then I'll jump into the comments. So he says, Gaius and Titius, while teaching him nothing about letters or literature, have caught out of his soul, long before he's old enough to choose, the possibility of having certain experiences. And that right there is bad enough, right? Certain experiences, which thinkers of more authority than they have held to be generous, fruitful, and humane. These great literary minds throughout history, Wordsworth, Shakespeare, Johnson, right, have not shied away from emotion, and they have treated of that emotion just really profoundly and beautifully And those authors seem to think that these were worthwhile experiences, what he calls generous, fruitful, and humane, and something that allows you to flourish and grow as a human being and individual, to cultivate that part of the human being, that emotional part. But what these educators are doing, unbeknownst to them even perhaps, is they're removing that possibility for a young reader to have those same experiences. So, all right, at this point, I'm going to look at some stuff. Okay. All right. So Newell said he's got to go. That's fine. All right, cool. Good to see we got more people here. So if you want to ask any questions along the way, it's not like a classroom. You can just raise your hand along the way, but I will periodically stop because I have just the reading in front of me, and then I'll have to come back to the main screen to see if there are any comments. So with just the reading in front of me, I'm not able to see anybody's hand up or so, but I will stop periodically, like at this moment. I see there are no questions, so we'll just keep going. All right. So then he says this. This is actually a paragraph break in the original, I believe. But the original, again, was a lecture, so I suppose it depends on your editor, but I do think this is a paragraph break because he starts on another thing. So then he says, there's a second book, a third author. He says, it's not only Gaius and Titius in the Green Book, what he calls, there's another author called Orbilius, and he does the same thing. He says he finds that the same operation under the same general aesthetic is being carried out. Orbilius debunks silly emotions too. But he chooses for his debunking a silly bit of writing on horses, where these animals are praised as the willing servants of early colonists in Australia. Right? And so using this example, you can think, oh, well, that's terrible writing. And Lewis would probably agree that's terrible writing. But not for the reason that Orbilius thinks. Orbilius will think that it's terrible writing because it's going to be emotional, right? And Lewis is going to get him on this. It's not terrible because it's emotional. It's terrible because it's bad writing. And so he says here, and he falls into the same trap as Gaius and Titius, of rooks and Sleipnir. These are legendary mythical animals. And the weeping horses of Achilles, and the war horse in the book of Job. Nay, even a Brer Rabbit and a Peter Rabbit, not just horses, but rabbits, he says, of man's prehistoric piety to our brother, the ox, even oxen. Of all that this semi-anthropomorphic treatment of beasts has meant in human history and of the literature where it finds noble or piquant expression, he has not a word to say. He totally bypasses all of that. He doesn't respect that. What does he do instead? We'll see. Even of the problems of animal psychology, as they exist for science, he says nothing as well. He does this instead. He contents himself with explaining that horses are not secundum literum, like literally speaking, interested in colonial expansion. Well, duh. Duh. Like, again, you have to ask yourself, if I were an idiot, could I have figured that out? Probably, right? So why are you needing an author of a children's book to tell you this, right? He says this piece of information is really all his pupils get from him. In other words, he erases and cuts out the possibility of like creative expression. He's like, well, of course, animals can't talk. They're not interested in certain things of human nature or something. Well, duh, right? Why the composition before them is bad, they do not hear. Much less do they learn of the two classes of men who are respectively above and below that such writing. Again, like he says, the man who really knows horses and really loves them honorably, not with anthropomorphic illusions, but with ordinate love. And the irredeemable blockhead, urban blockhead, whom a horse is merely an old-fashioned means of transport, right? Both of these men are going to be immune to that writing, just like we saw with the article on patriotism. He says, some pleasure in their ponies and dogs they will have lost. This is what's happening to the students. All right. Some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received. That's interesting because, again, why does Lewis say this? Some incentive to cruelty or neglect. Why? Well, because, again, Orbilius, just as Gaius and Titius did, is directing his readers, his pupils, his students, to not respect and appreciate the love that is whatever emotion, whether it be beauty in the waterfall example or the love here. It's like not to respect that, look at it with condescension, right? So they will receive this. If you don't properly, as he says, say, ordinately love certain things, then this will be just the necessary effect. Some pleasure in their own knowingness will have entered their minds. They're going to be, again, you can't bubble a knowing fellow, can't be bubbled out of his cash, right? You take on a certain perspective that this view has on you, right? That is their day's lesson in English. Though of English they have learned nothing. Another little portion of the human heritage has been quietly taken from them before they were old enough to understand. Excuse me. So he says here, I've hitherto been assuming that such teachers as Gaius and Titius do not fully realize what they're doing and do not intend the far-reaching consequences it will usually actually have. There is, of course, another possibility. Let me see where I can find that. He says here, they may be intending to make a clean sweep of traditional values and start with a new set. That position will be discussed later. As again, he gave us our marching orders and what's to come. He said, I will eventually address the actual position they discussed, that is value relativism. I will address that, but first I'm going to just look at the educational procedure or the effect this view, more or value relativism, has on the educational procedure. So he says here, if the position which Gaius and Titius are holding, if it is the position which Gaius and Titius are holding, I must for the moment content myself with pointing out that it is a philosophical position and not a literary position. Of course, this is pretty obvious, right? And then he says, in filling their book with it, they have been unjust to the parent or headmaster who buys it, and who's got the work of amateur philosophers where he expected the work of professional grammarians. A man who would be annoyed if his son returned from the dentist with his teeth untouched and his head crammed with the dentist obiter dicta on bimetallism or Baconian theory. But I doubt whether Gaius and Titius have really planned, under the cover teaching of English, to propagate their philosophy. Again, he's giving them kind of the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't intend this, or maybe they did. I don't know. I think they may have slipped it in for the following reasons. In the first place, it was easy. Literary criticism is difficult, and what they actually do is very much easier, right? And he says, in the second place, I think Gaius and Titius may have honestly misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. And this is what we started with. He says, they do see the world swayed by emotional propaganda, but they've learned from tradition that youth is sentimental. And they conclude that the best thing they can do to inoculate against that emotional, basically, emotional malformation, emotional immaturity, the best thing to do is to fortify the mind of young people against emotion. Well, just don't feel emotion at all. That's how you get to fortify against emotional immaturity, is to just fortify against emotion. And he says, Lewis, in my own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments, not to dismiss sentiment at all. He says, by starving the sensibility or sentiments or emotions of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes, right? Because we don't know. Look, he's making a point here that human beings will be affected by emotions regardless. Like, the best protection against that is to prepare and to be in touch with one's emotions and to get ready to know when your emotions are being toyed with and manipulated or not, right? And he says, for a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. All right. Okay. we are going to stop there and pause there, and then we're going to continue. And I'll get to a couple of comments here and questions. Again, I'm taking questions periodically. I don't know when they pop up, but I will pause periodically and take questions and comments and so on. Good to see you, Casper. And good to see you, Mary. So if you missed the first part of this, of course, it'll be a live replay. You can go back and look, whatever you missed. So, all right. A New Allside also says, he left and then he's going to come back after to watch what he misses. So, all right, let's keep going. So again, this is a lecture, by the way, for those who are just joining, on Men Without Chests. And it's a writing, originally a lecture by C.S. Lewis, and he is a dog with a bone. He is addressing, he's actually criticizing an elementary textbook that is a high school textbook. Like what problems? Lewis, again, he's the author of Chronicles of Narnia, but he's not just a children's book author. He is a scholar of English literature and classics at Oxford and Cambridge. So he's got serious credentials. So if anybody has a problem and has something to offer in terms of criticism of certain textbooks, it will be him, because he's the subject matter expert. But it's not English that he's after. He actually faults these authors on not teaching English and grammar and literature and so on. He faults them for sneaking in a philosophical theory, right? So if you're interested, for example, in how insidious philosophical theories get insidiously placed into education, like if you're a homeschooler or something, if you were just worried about people kind of teaching uncritically and students uncritically imbibing certain things, or maybe you're worried yourself if you went maybe picked up something along the way, right? This is exactly of interest to you. And then also the specific theory he's discussing of value relativism, closely related with moral relativism. Value relativism is of interest to him. He's addressing it. So he hasn't gotten to that criticism yet. He's only talking about, okay, if Gaius and Titius are teaching this to their students, what effect might that have on the students? Okay, so that's what he's talking about so far. But so let's back up and show you what he's done right here. He says, there are two reasons. He says, I doubt whether Gaius and Titius have really planned to propagate this philosophical theory. Again, it's not a literary position. It is a philosophical, not a literary position. But I doubt whether they tried. Maybe they just did it and they didn't realize they were doing it. That's fine. He says, I think there are three reasons why they slipped it in. Maybe they didn't do it intentionally. First is because it's hard. It's hard to do literary criticism. Secondly, because he thinks that they think that they're helping the children by stealing themselves, stealing the children. That is like hardening their hearts, stealing them against emotion. Okay. And then he says here, there's a third and profounder reason for the procedure which Gaius and Titius adopt. He says, they may be perfectly ready to admit that a good education should build some sentiments while destroying others. He says, again, he's kind of playing this. Maybe they agree with me on this point. Maybe they agree that good education should cultivate certain good emotions. They may endeavor to do so. But it is impossible that they should succeed, at least if they're using this method. He says, do what they will. It is the debunking side of their work, and this side alone, which will really tell. In order to grasp this necessity clearly, I must digress for a moment to show what may be called the educational predicament of Gaius and Titius, and how that educational predicament is different from all of their predecessors. All right. So at this moment, Lewis is going to do a little sidebar, I digress, this little side quest, and he's going to talk about value relativism, and for all of human history, what people have believed in. He's basically going to say, look, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe they believed in value relativism, value objectivism. They believed value object. That is Lewis's view. That's against the view that Gaius and Titius are holding, which is value relativism. So he's going to say, Lewis says, look, for all of human history, and he'll go through this, he says, for example, he just starts name dropping. And for this, you might think, well, why is he doing this? He's kind of the side quest, and he's just name dropping this litany of names: Augustine, Aristotle, Plato and the Republic, Who else? The Rata in Hinduism, right here. He's just all over the place. Plato, again, with the good, and the Wordsworth, Indian masters, the Chinese, the Tao, and then he gets into the Confucius and the intellects, and then Jews who praise the law. And it's like, at this point, you're like, what are you talking about, Lewis? There's a reason for this. He goes through that whole spiel, and then he says, look, this conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to, for brevity, simply as the Tao. Now, I hate that he does this. I'll be honest with you. I don't like that he does this. What does he mean by the Tao? First of all, why did he say Tao here, and then he says Tao here, which is Taoism from the Chinese? Like, if there's one criticism I have of this piece, it's that, man, use a different label. But why does he call it Tao? He doesn't mean the Chinese Tao of Taoism. He says, what is common to them all, right here, I shall henceforth refer all of these as the Tao. Well, what is common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It is the doctrine of objective value. Okay, so what does he mean by that? Let me show you here. Again, we said that all of this was value relativism. We can draw a similar, and I will actually, we can draw a similar situation where there is value objectivism. Okay, and there's an umbrella. Oh, let me pull that up a little bit more. Okay, this is value objectivism, and it breaks down into different varieties. You can have moral objectivism. You can have aesthetic objectivism. You can have even religious objectivism and political object. What does this mean? This means that he'll explain here in a minute, but objectivism basically means that there is a real mind-independent truth to these things. Like, for example, if I look at the door frame and I said that door frame is about 7 feet tall, then that is an objective claim about the door frame. That is, I'm not saying it about my feelings. Remember, we started off with this example of Lewis gives an example. The waterfall is sublime right here. The waterfall is sublime, right? And Gase and Titius are value relativists, so they're going to take this to mean just this. I have sublime feeling. In other words, they're going to say that if you try to say that an object like the door frame is pretty, well, you're just saying something about your own feelings. You're not saying, and this only has to do, by the way, with, again, predicates of value. Predicates of value, okay? Predicates of value. Again, what are predicates of value? There are these things, right? Moral goodness is a value. Aesthetic goodness, that is beauty, is a value. And all of these are just value, predicates of value, right? So moral goodness is one. Teach you a different one here. Right here. Okay. Each one of these, but they all are an instance of objectivism, value objectivism. Okay. Each one of these are values. Now, that is to say, like, let's take a aesthetic objectivism. So this is, by the way, in contrast with this aesthetic relativism. If I'm a relativist with respect to aesthetics or beauty, I will truly believe that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Right? This is just what this means. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is this. The idea that if it's beautiful to you, then it just is beautiful, full stop. There's no further explanation needed. Contrast this with value objectivism. So aesthetic objectivism here, this would be the view that certain things are really beautiful and certain things are really not beautiful, and that beauty is a real property. Just like the door frame is 7 feet tall, well, that's a real property of the door frame. It's not in my mind. It really is out there. So this would be like this. If I say that the waterfall is beautiful, I'm saying that beauty is in the waterfall itself. It's not in my mind. It really is present there. So this is a really stark contrast between what Gayes and Tish's are teaching versus what Lewis is teaching. Lewis is an objective, a moral objectivist. Gayes and Tish's are a value relativist. Okay, so in other words, doctrine of objective value. Let's actually underline that. Doctrine of objective value. That is Lewis's position. Full stop. So in other words, he is a value objectivist, right? He really does believe with respect to morality, beauty, so on and so forth. Like those are real properties. The waterfall really does have the property of beauty in it. Morality really is present and so on. And he goes on to say this. He says, it is the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. Those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable or wise is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the times. It's not just to say something psychological about our own state of mind, but to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. And here, I like this next line because Lewis actually tells upon himself. And he's consistent. He says, I myself do not enjoy the society of small children. In other words, I hate kids. It's actually really hilarious. If you hate kids, this would be a nice way to say, I don't enjoy the society of small children, right? But Lewis calls himself out and he says, look, but because I speak from within the Tao, I recognize this as a defect in myself. I am wrong to not like children because children are objectively delightful. He says, just as a man may have to recognize that he's tone deaf or colorblind. All right. Let me pull here. All right. And right, I'm going to pause there and I'm going to look at some of these comments. So Casper says this. All right. I support the idea that education should teach children to think by giving them the right tools to do so, by teaching them objective knowledge, different facts for emotions and tools like reading and math. In that regard, education based on faith is quite problematic. All right, notice we haven't said anything about faith whatsoever here. We're only talking philosophically, right? Lewis is a Christian, I'm a Christian, but all that is immaterial. Matters nothing at all because we're not talking about a religious education at all. We're not talking about articles of faith whatsoever. We haven't said anything about God existing or Jesus Christ rising from the dead at all. None of this is religious content whatsoever. This is all a philosophical position, as he says so himself, right? It's a philosophical position. It's not a grammar lesson. So if we're like dividing up the disciplines, right, this would fall squarely into a philosophical position. It's not a religious position whatsoever. So thanks for your comment. All right. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. So he says here, right? So the question is like, why did he bring up all these, right? Right? And like I said, he says all of them, the conception is all its forms, I will refer to as the doctrine of objective value. This is a really fascinating insight. Lewis is claiming here explicitly, and he says so up here, that for all of human history, and until quite modern times, all teachers, even all men, believed in the doctrine of objective value. They were, until quite recently, moral and value objectivists. Okay? So Lewis, if you're thinking like a philosopher here, if you're a philosopher and you're listening to this this lesson and you've gotten this far, he is really in the context here historically. I think he's probably thinking of emotivists and non-cognitivists of that stripe, right? Anti-realist, of course, moral anti-realist. So he's thinking of non-cognitivists and specifically probably emotivists. Again, because if I say that the waterfall is sublime, I don't really mean that it has the property of sublimity or beauty. I really just mean that that's a property of myself. So, or just that these things just describe my psychological or emotional state at the time, right? And that's basically what an emotivist will say. So it's pretty clear that he has that view in mind, but he just never says it, right? And he rarely says anything. But he's a good communicator because he kind of talks around the philosophical theories without having to get into the nuts and bolts of the philosophical theories. Of course, the philosophical theories, and of course that has its drawbacks because he can say something rhetorically and kind of gloss over exceptions and nuances because he is, after all, as a good communicator, he's a good rhetorician. Does that mean he's lying? Not necessarily. So he says here, until quite modern times, this is actually true. All men believe the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. In other words, there were appropriate responses. Again, what he said about the Tao, like things really are true about the world, right? And then my response can be congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. The reason, he says, the Coleridge agreed with the tourist who had called the cataract or the waterfall sublime, beautiful, and disagreed with the one who called it pretty, was of course because he believed inanimate nature to be such that certain responses could be more just or ordinate or appropriate to it than others. In other words, Lewis here says explicitly that Coleridge was a value objectivist. And he's already said explicitly up here that really for all of history, for all of time, people have mostly been value objectivists. And this is actually true, right? Now, he doesn't say that universally it's always only been this way, right? Because you do have the seeds of modern relativism and anti-realism in people like the sophists, namely Protagoras, whose famous line is that man is the measure of all things. This would be a really relativist position. So, in other words, like he's not saying that all people throughout all of history have believed it. So, actually, let's get clear on what he's. So what do I mean that there is? I need something as an example. Yeah, something as an example. Where's my? Here we go. Aha, yes. Okay, what am I gonna use? All right. I suppose, yes. I always like my markers. Here we go. Okay, I found one. I was looking for one. All right, marker, right? So let's suppose that this is something that people disagree about, right? So what do I mean, or what does Lewis mean when he says for all of human history, people have been value objectivists? Here's what he means. They might disagree about this marker. You might have, say, some population of people saying that marker is our God, it is divine, it is supernatural, right? And then you have this people over here who says, no, that marker right there is an idol. It's not really a God. It just, you're wrong about that, right? So you have these people over here saying that is a divine supernatural being. You have these people over here saying that that's an idol. What both people agree upon is that they are saying something and attributing it really to that object. They are being objective about their attributions. Not both of them are correct, of course, but they're saying that they are saying, I really think that this is a God. They're not saying, oh, to me, it just feels like, and it will people, oh, to me, it just feels like relative to me, I'm just saying this is. No, they were both attributing to that object certain features and recognizing those features in the objects fallibly, right? They could be wrong about that thing, but they were taking an objective approach to these things, right? So Hindus might say, well, this has divinity in it. Islam, Muslims, they might say, well, that has no divinity. What are you talking about? But they are really saying something true or saying something about the object. And then that claim is an objective claim. That's like me talking about the door frame again. It's like, I might say that the door frame is 12 feet tall. If I make the claim, the door frame is 12 feet tall, that is still an objective claim. It's just a false claim, right? What I'm not saying is that it feels like to me the door frame is 12 feet. I'm not saying that, right? That would be a subjective or a relative claim. Relative to me, it feels like, or from my perspective or something like that, right? I'm saying I'm attributing 12 feet really to the door frame, saying that it really truly does objectively have that feature. Of course, I'm wrong about that in that case, but all right. So he says here, until quite modern times, all these examples, Augustine, Aristotle, all these different religious traditions have all held that view, right? For all of human history, until like 5 minutes ago, historically speaking, we've all been value objectivists, except the sophists. So in other words, like the ocean of, you think about the metaphor here, the ocean of all these traditions have all been objective value objectivism. But you might have like a small wave or current here that's of value relativism or something. So I think, if anything, if Lewis is right here, and I think he is, if Lewis is right here, this means that if you have kind of this new, new theory that shows up on the scene that has never before been widely endorsed, historically speaking, that should give you some pause. Right? For all of human history, no matter what their disagreements, people have always agreed about this thing. That should give you some pause, at the very least. I'm not saying that it's way one way or the other as being the thing that seals the deal on it. Value relativism could still be true, but it should at the very least give you pause that you have this novel theory, relatively novel theory on the scene that nobody's ever held, and yet you think it just to be, again, like, it just seems like common sense. We just we just learned this growing up. Beauty's subjective. It's like, oh, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. What else would it be, right? At this point, I tell my students, look, so if this is true, the doctrine of objective value, this means that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. All right, let me pull that up. I want to go very. I want to maybe stir the pot a little bit. Let's look at this. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beautiful things in the world, and there are real, truly ugly things in the world. Now, at this point, this should be truly offensive to many. That's what your assessment should be. And again, like I said, for all of human history, Lewis is right about this. Aside from a little blip in the radar here and there, we have believed this exact thing. The beauties and things really are objectively beautiful. Now, at this moment, I kind of open it up to my students. I'm like, okay, what do you guys think? Like, is this offensive, right? And let me see right here. So what subjective means in this context. It means relative to the speaker, and that it's mind dependent. So if a speaker, thinks that something is beautiful, then it really just is beautiful. Like that, end of the story right here. And so it says, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but we all have the same eyes. That's super interesting. I suppose that'd be one way to kind of retort and say and explain the objectivist position here. But this really is the objectivist position. The value objectivist. Right? Would say this. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Now, of course, this sounds, like I said, extremely offensive. Right? This means people are ugly. Certain people are ugly, right? I mean, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know what to tell you. I do actually know what to tell you. Here's what I would say. Right? I think we can modify this and say that beauty is not merely in the eye of the beholder. I don't think it's entirely in the eye of the beholder. I think that certain things are in the eye of the beholder and certain things aren't. Okay? So there are certain objective features of beauty, right? There's certain objective features of beauty. Are you ready to go? I cannot find it. Okay. I should have had this pulled up. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I got it now. Yeah, well, maybe not. Okay, I'll just go without this. So, certain things, beauty does have objective properties. This is my view. I think it's right. I think that Lewis would agree with this. Certain features of beauty, let's say, things like what's that called? Clarity. Or luminance. Another big one is proportionality. Another big one is healthfulness. Health, that is healthfulness. That something is healthy and not dead, right? So if somebody says, like if my students tell me and try to allege that, you know what, beauty is an eye of the beholder, they will defend this. They'll say, oh, that sounds ridiculous, sounds offensive. Of course, beauty is an eye of the beholder because, you know, everything, you know, they don't want to be too offensive, right? And so I give them an example. I say, well, what about poop, feces, right? What if I was somebody who just really enjoyed the look of feces, and I really loved it. Every time I walk my dog, I go into the neighborhood, I look for like a hound myself. I'm looking for just beautiful, to me beautiful specimens of feces. I like the shape of them. I like the texture of them, consistency. It's just how big, whether it's in a little spiral. And at home, I have a little shrine to them, you know, and so I arrange them in a row, quarter, according to color and consistency and so on. To me, that's beautiful. So I guess you got to think that I'm right about that. To me, it's beautiful. So it's beautiful. Like, just, there's no question. And then I asked them, am I going to be somebody like you invite to your parents and be like, oh, nothing's really wrong with him. He's a totally like well-adjusted, good, you know, like you're going to think that something's wrong with me, obviously. So this is because I don't think that beauty is entirely in the eye of the beholder. I don't think it's entirely subjective. I think that, and this is all that's required, by the way, to invalidate value relativism, is to say that there are at least some objective features of beauty. And these are going to be the things that are objective features. Let's start with this one, proportionality, right? So let's think about, like, many students will raise the example of women and their standards of beauty, right? Well, the standards of beauty have changed over time, therefore it's subjective, right? No, actually. Not entirely subjective anyway, because there's a little feature here called proportionality. That is a objective standard. Things have to be proportional. Now, the way in which they are considered proportional, totally up to taste and interpretation, right? And I give the example of in interior design, or in photography, right? There are certain objective principles in these trades, in these fields. Photography, for example, the rule of thirds. If you know about photography, that is an objective standard for good photography. And of course, like, you can play around with that. You can play within that. Even music, guys. Right? Music has to have objective standards, right? It has to have bars. It has to have bars. It has to have notes, right? Imagine somebody calling some piece of music beautiful and it has no notes whatsoever. It's just all rest. It's like, no, that's not, arguably wouldn't even be music, right? So it has to have some meaningfulness, and it has to have orderliness. That would be another one here, order. You can even, yeah. So music Like, of course, you have to know the objective rules with respect to music, but then once you know the rules, you can play within that, right? So, like even jazz plays within the rules, but it doesn't disregard the rules whatsoever, right? Disregarding the rules whatsoever would be like going around and just slamming everything onto a piano, or heck, just putting a wrecking ball through a piano and calling it music. Like, that's not music, right? Because it's not playing according to the rules, according to the objective features of beautiful music, right? In photography as well, rule of thirds. Like, again, I have to follow that rule. I can bend the rule. I can play within the rules, within the boundaries of it. I can maybe even at certain points test the rule, right? So long as I bring into play other objective features, right? So this is the reason why my example about feces, being beautiful. This would be a good reason why feces is not beautiful, because it's not healthful. It's a sign of disease and death. That's why feces is disgusting, right? So this is right here, this healthfulness would rule out feces being beautiful. Yeah. So, and you might think, so think about it. So somebody has said this before. They've said, well, certain cultures believe that poop is beautiful, right? So I actually was in a discussion with John, what's his name? Gleason, Godless Engineer. He's on YouTube. He's got a good channel. Well, he's got a big channel, let's say. I don't think it's good because it's all atheist stuff. But anyway, he's well known. He's got a good following. And I brought up this example of objective value, namely in beauty, and that I brought up the feces example. And of course, he was scandalized by it, rightfully so. And then, but I said, and he said, well, there are certain cultures that worship poop. But every single example that he brought up, let's say over in India, they have a poop festival for their Hindu god, like cow shit is basically holy to them. Or over in Spain, they have a poop festival where they fling poo at each other, as a sort of a form of game or something. And then over in Africa somewhere, they praise the poop god for their crops. But notice that every single one of those examples, they are not worshiping or adoring or finding beautiful the poop itself for its actual poop properties. Like, let's take it one by one. In India, they were not worshiping the poop itself. They were worshiping it because, by extension, it was related to a god, namely the cow god. And so that made the cow was holy, and so its product was holy. Same thing in Africa. Let's take it out of order. A third example I gave. They were appreciative of the poop because it helped their crops grow. It was the manure, which, so it was like a crop and agricultural festival. And then in the game up in Spain, I think it was, that where the children were flinging poo at each other and so on, that was just a game. It was like a tongue-in-cheek, fun example. It's not like they were actually worshiping or enjoying or finding beautiful the poop itself. It's almost like the poop emoji, right? So it's not, oh, that's funny because it's funny, right? It's not like, hey, everybody, we have a new standard of beauty and feces is it. Like, look, it's just ridiculous, right? So, so let's look at this. So everyone liking something does not make it objective. It only makes us similar. Correct, yeah. But I think it's a good indication that it is objective, right? And I think this puts the pressure on a subjectivist when you have universal agreement, right? You're right that it does make it universal, and that's a distinction from universal is not the same as objective, right? Okay, let's go up here, look at a couple other things. Oh, I got some really nice stuff. Okay. Hey, Alex, good to see you. Who says it's offensive is just false. The idea that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. I don't think it's offensive, right? But if you get and you say, look, why can't a woman with Down syndrome be on the cover of Sports Illustrated? And you say, well, because we have objective beauty standards, she's not beautiful, she can't be on the cover. That's highly offensive, right? To that person at least, and probably to many more people. So, all right. Dung beetles play with poop. You guys are getting good examples here. Okay. Back to the the example of the music, different races and ethnicities find different type of music and melody beautiful. That's true. And it could be considered music if it were a different culture. Good point as well. But notice that in every culture, if you guys listen to other cultural, like world music or something like that, right, there are always notes, right? Because they're like objective standards according to which something counts as music or not music. And the things that kind of border on this are like EDM music or thrash metal or something like that, where it's like, well, just because it's noise doesn't mean it's necessarily music. I admit those are like gray cases, but even those are arguably still music because they play within the bounds of the objective standards and what it means to make music, right? Even though it sounds like noise. Okay. This underscores what I was saying earlier. It's not going to be right here, Indians locale dung. It's not going to be necessarily the feces itself or its objective properties. Like, hey, I love the smell of it. Like nobody, no philosopher I know of, no sane person I know of, well-adjusted person I know of, is going to say, I really love the smell and the taste and consistency of dung and I spread it on me. It's like if you're doing that, you're doing that. Let's say you spread it on you, which is weird. It's not a practice I've heard of, but hey, it may happen. If you're doing that, you're doing it for secondary properties. You're not doing it because you like it itself, right? You're doing it because of what the benefits it might bring, for example, or you're doing it for shock value, right? Oh, because this other thing that I want to happen, namely to shock people, is more important than the discomfort and disgust of wiping poop on me or something like that, right? Yeah, that's true. It's not, you're right. I did say it's a product of the thing. Yeah, waste. But yeah, technically speaking, just in terms of it was something that was produced, by the cow. And so by extension, if the cow's holy, then that thing that it produces or has an effect upon is going to be holy. This is the same thing in Catholicism, like even things that certain things touch, right? Like this is how you get relics, even in Judaism, and I think in Hinduism, well, things that holy things touch is going to be holy itself. It's just by extension. Thanks, Alex. This is a new feature that I've been wanting to use for a very long time, so I can actually do class lessons. So this is one of my class lessons that I kind of am trying to adapt to this venue. But glad you guys are here. All right, so he says there's no pressure universal agreement as a result of shared evolutionary history. Yeah, that's what an anti-realist is going to have to say, right? Because ultimately, morality, metaethically speaking, can only be grounded in one of three ways. One, it has to be biological or evolutionary. Two, it has to be social or cultural. Or three, it has to be transcendent. Okay? So if you're an atheist and certainly anti-realist, you are going to rule out, most atheists will rule that out. And certainly if you're anti-realist, you will rule out that third option. Okay, that is transcendent. So that leaves only two, right? It's either going to be evolutionary, biological, or social, cultural, right? And so most people, of course, are going to, most anti-realists, because what it means to be anti-realist, it means that it's mind dependent. It's dependent on human minds. So, well, they've got to get it somehow, whether within themselves, either evolutionary, like as a non-cognitive way, or they've got to get it through social, cultural agreement or something like that. Or it just may be individualism, and that's relativism or so on. But it's got to be one of those three ways, right? Depending on the person, either evolutionary, biological, maybe even metaphysical. Aristotle grounds it in metaphysics of a human person, or it's got to be social, cultural, or something. So, yeah, it's not surprising that you would say, oh, well, it's got to be shared evolutionary history. That's just one of the options, but you would, of course, need to defend that. That does not come for free. It's a cultural and evolutionary and cultural. Again, this is not something you get for free. You have to defend that. I think for my part, I'll just say this. I've said this in other contexts elsewhere, but for my part, I think there are problems with both, right? So obviously for the third part, transcendent, obviously that needs to be argued for as well. You don't get that for free. I absolutely guarantee that. But look, you're left with these two. These two are not necessarily going to win out, right? Evolutionarily speaking, it could be, let's just use the example of because it happens in nature, because it's effective, because it's selected for by nature, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be morally good, right? So you can select for the survival of the fittest. We could select for, I don't know, for people who are the strongest muscularly, that those are going to be the people who live, and everybody else who are unhealthy and sick, we'll just do away with them. Like, that is what evolution like lives by and breathes by. Why should it? Why? I mean, on evolution, because it's so brutal, and even evolutionary biologists will agree to this, it is a brutal landscape, right? Nature is not very kind, especially if you have like disabilities or injuries or something like that. There are no real like human principles like or human dignity on that. It's just, you don't have that. It's not built in. And also, if you're going by nature, well, in nature you get certain things like like right here, I disagree, strictly tied to what's natural. It's in nature that spiders eat their young, therefore we got to eat their young. People make this argument too. It's a naturalistic fallacy. It's like, well, it happens in nature that you see homosexuality between animals, therefore it must be okay within humans because that's just natural, right? But again, like, you wouldn't make that argument with respect to spiders eating their mates or spiders eating their young or something like that. So, but again, cultural as well. I mean, look, just because a culture adopts a certain morality doesn't mean that it is morally good. Just because a culture adopts certain practices, because again, go back to Nazi Germany, they adopted certain practices that were internally coherent and consistent, right? Get rid of the Jewish people, make room for the Germans, right? That doesn't mean that it's going to be a morally good situation, that those principles will actually be morally good principles, right? So each one of these, like I said, there are three. And atheists and anti-realists and non-theists and skeptics all want to get rid of that third one. They want to say, oh, it can't be transcendent, right? And look, transcendence doesn't even mean that it's going to be religious, right? You can be a good Platonist, or you can be, you could be a panpsychist even, right? And believe that morality is somehow grounded in transcendence or something. Transcendent beyond the individual and beyond human beings themselves, not grounded in the mind, right? And morality is real and objective for that reason. So I'd encourage you. I mean, I think there are problems. I think people don't think about this enough. They just sort of reject transcendence because, oh, that's religious. And then they go immediately to evolutionary or cultural, social explanations, and they don't even realize that there are like glaring problems with each one of them. So, let me see this. Oh, could there be multiple gods? Would you go against that? No, you know me, Alex, you called in. And I'm a Catholic, so yeah, we don't believe in polytheism, of course. Some Protestants will be like, yes, you do. You believe in saints, and it's like, no, those aren't gods. Or even a Muslim would say, oh, yes, you do. You believe in the Trinity, but that's not three gods. That's God, one God, three in one. So in any case, all right. Let's keep going because we still haven't finished the rest of the reading. So, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so all that to say, we're talking about beauty and being the eye of the beholder, being subjective. Lewis points out that, look, for all of human history, we have all been moral and value objectivists, not just moral objectivists, but value objectivists. Again, values of all kind, moral goodness, that'd be moral objectivism. Values like beauty, that would be aesthetic objectivism, and so on and so forth. So we all been value objectivists for all of human history, aside from some exceptions here or there, right? And so he's teasing that out, right? And so then I'm going to move forward towards the end of this reading. And so he says here, perhaps this will become clear if we take a concrete instance, right? For all of human history, this will become clearer. We've all believed this one thing, value objectivism. He says, when a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he said. Right? He wasn't just saying, oh, this is just how I feel. It's a psychological fact about my own state of mind. relative to me, it's just a subjective feeling. You can believe whatever you want. No, he was a value objectivist. And when he says a dignified and honorable and glorifying thing to die for your country, he really believed that it really truly was those things. He was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared, and which he believed to be in accord with the value with his judgment discerned in noble death. He was giving the boy the best he had, given of his spirit to humanize him as he had given of his body to beget him. But Gaius and Titius, his interlocutors, Lewis is after these two authors who wrote a children's English book, school textbook, and he's dog with a bone. He's not going to let him go. Gaius and Titius cannot believe that in calling such a death sweet and seemly, they would be saying something important about something. Gaius and Titius, in other words, are value relativists. They, on their view, think that if the Roman father is saying this, he's just recording a fact about his own state, right? And this is what he's saying. Gaius and Titius can't believe that the Roman father would be saying something important about something. He's saying nothing important about anything, just about his own state of mind. Their own method, Gaius and Titius, of debunking would cry out against them if they attempted to do so. For death is not something to eat and therefore cannot be dulce in the literal sense. Dulce means something sweet, right? It can't be dulce in the literal sense, and it is unlikely that the real sensations preceding it will be dulce even by analogy. In other words, it's not going to feel good. And as for decorum, seemliness, that is only a word describing, again, they're doing he's using this as, Lewis is using this as an example. This is how they would debunk it, basically. Decorum can't mean anything. It can't mean sweet and seemly, dulce and decorum. Can't mean that. Because they would say, that's only a word describing how some other people will feel about your death when they happen to think about it. Which won't be often, and will certainly do you no good. There are only two sources open against Titius. Either they must go the whole way and debunk this sentiment like any other, or they must set themselves to work to produce from outside a sentiment which they believe to be no value to the pupil, and which may cost him his life, because it is useful to us, the survivors, that our young men should feel it. So he's describing this sort of situation that's kind of a difficult sort of rat's nest that they've gotten themselves into. They are trying to, much like I was trying to describe, like they think this is a viable option to say that this is. Let me pull down that comment. Sorry about that. They think this is a viable option to go with to debunk emotional descriptions of things, right? Dulce and decorum, it can't be sweet and seemly and so on. But they're getting themselves into a tangle. All right, let's keep going. He says right here. All right, so I'm going to read from here. And this is super interesting because I like this part. So Lewis, he says here, without the aid of trained emotions, again, this whole piece, Men Without Chests, he's describing chests as this chest magnanimity sentiment, the chest, which is the seat of emotion. Okay, it's where you find emotion, and of course, these authors are trying to root that out of their pupils and schoolboys, so that when they become men, they will be really strong and they won't be sentimental, right? But he's saying here, if you don't have emotions, if you don't have trained emotions, the intellect is actually powerless against the animal organism. All right? The intellect is actually powerless. Now, it's one thing to say, so Lewis is adopting a view of emotion on which emotion, I think he's getting this from Thomas Aquinas, by the way. He gets a few things from Thomas Aquinas. He's getting this. On Thomas Aquinas' view, let's actually put this up. On Thomas Aquinas' view, let me pull this up. On Thomas Aquinas' view, emotions are neither good nor bad. They are morally neutral. All right? Emotions are morally neutral. In and of themselves, per se, that is. But of course, emotions can be either good or bad. How do they become good or bad? They can be good, as I said, or bad. How? Here we go. They can be good if they are governed by reason and aimed at the proper object. Directed, let's say, directed to their proper object. Okay? And bad if not. We'll just say, if not governed by reason, directed to the proper object. Okay? So this is a two-part requirement, all right? Number one, governed by reason, and two, directed to their proper object. So take, for example, sorrow. Okay? Sorrow, if it is not governed by reason, that is, if it's unreasonable, if it's overwhelming, then it's going to be bad. It has to be governed by reason, in moderation, in proper portion, and so on. Also, it has to be directed to its proper object. What does that mean? Well, I have to be sorrowful over something that's bad, right? By proper object, it's going to be either good or bad, right? So in the case of sorrow, the object, when it is directed towards a bad, that's a good thing. Not always with every emotion. Like with happiness, for example, it's got to be it's got to be directed towards something that's good in order to be good. Sorrow, it's got to be directed towards something bad in order to be good. What does this mean? So if I'm sorrowful, for example, if I'm sorrowful over my sister-in-law, God bless her, she is about to have a child. She may have even already had the child. Like she's like 9 months plus pregnant. Now, if I was sorrowful over hearing the news that she had a baby, like that's a good object. That's good news that I'm hearing, and yet I'm being sorrowful over it. That would not be a good emotion, right? I need to be sorrowful over bad things. Same with anger. That also requires that the object be bad, right? If I'm angry over something good, I hear of a coworker that gets a promotion. That's a good thing, and yet I'm getting angry over it. That's not going to be good. I need to be angry over bad things. And of course, it also needs to be governed by reason in proper moderation and so on. So now that is what we are saying about emotions. Now, this is, by the way, this is just Aquinas' view of emotions. This just is Aquinas' view. C.S. Lewis is already adopting this view, and he's already assuming this view. In other words, that emotions are not inherently irrational. They're not inherently irrational. They are non-rational, but they're not irrational. Irrational means contrary to reason. That's something that the authors of the Green Book, Gaius and Titius, want to say. They're contrary to reason to be an emotional person. Or to have emotion or experience emotion whatsoever. Just emotions are contrary to reason. Lewis, and following Aquinas, says, no, they're not contrary to reason. They're non-rational. In other words, they're not reason themselves. And nobody thought that. Nobody thought that emotions just are your reason. No, they're separate parts of the mind. So certainly, yeah, they're not going to be rational. That's just all what non-rational means. And this follows not only Aquinas, this follows Aristotle, this follows Plato. You might remember the analogy of the soul as being the intellect, that like a chariot drawn by two horses, right? The charioteer is the intellect, the reason, and you got the spiritedness and the appetites and so on, who are the two horses, and you've got to like control them and govern them and train them and, you know, guide them where you go, right? So this has been a view for a very long time. So all that to say, this view is something that Lewis is presupposing here, but he goes even further in this passage, and he says this: not only are emotions not contrary to reason, they're not irrational, so they're good. They had to be trained by reason, but that's what this means. The trained emotion means trained by reason. Okay, but if you don't have trained emotions, trained by reason, here's what happens. The intellect is actually powerless. Like, you need the trained emotions in order for the intellect to work at all. It's not just that they benefit the intellect, and that's a good bonus. It's really nice to have emotions that go along with the intellect and help them. If you don't have trained emotions, your intellect will be powerless against what does this mean? The animal organism. What does he mean by that? Well, he gives us an example down here. He gives us this example right here. In battle, it is not syllogisms. In fact, Lewis is actually a veteran of World War I. So I don't know if he was ever actually in a foxhole over in France or somewhere, but he's a veteran of World War I. He knows about military war, and he says this: it's a battle. In battle is not in syllogism, and not syllogism that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their post in the third hour of bombardment. The crudest sentimentalism or emotionalism, the Gayes and Titius would say, that's corny, about a flag or government or regiment will be of far more use. In other words, you're not sitting there in a foxhole thinking, a logical syllogism, if A, then B, if A, okay, A, I've got to stay to my post, B, therefore, right? That's not going to be helpful to you at all. But what will be far more helpful is that cheesy, military commercial you saw, GoArmy.com, or, the few, the proud, the Marines, or, I don't know, Lee Greenwood's God Bless America or something like that, that is going to be far more helpful for you to keep your nerves down. In other words, going back to this, if you do not have emotions, not just emotion, but trained emotions, trained by reason, then you will not do well when the time comes. You won't be prepared at all. And so it takes him almost to the end, right? We're at the penultimate paragraph, the almost end of this paragraph, right? So he said, this is the second to last, this is the last paragraph. And he takes him all the way to the second to last paragraph before he even repeats what the title was. So I tell my students, look, some authors are, I guess not just authors, because Lewis does this sometimes, but some pieces are such that you know exactly why they're titled. Like I'm actually doing one a week from today. I'll do another live stream lesson where I'm discussing the C.S. Lewis piece called The Three Parts of Morality. Like, it's very clear from that title alone exactly what you should pick up. It's going to be about 3 parts of morality. I may not know what the parts are, but by the time I finish reading that, I should know what the parts are, and I know exactly what to look for. In this reading, Men Without Chest, it's not clear what I'm supposed to be looking for. And so you can maybe pick it up along the way, but like sometimes authors will hide these little nuggets throughout the writing, or towards the end, they'll tuck it in, away in a kind of throwaway comment or something like that, or kind of build to it as a surprise. And, for better or worse, Lewis does both, but for better or worse, it's just not very clear what you're supposed to be looking for. And it's not really clear what this phrase means until the very end. Men without chests. What does it mean? It doesn't mean, some people will guess, it means like like top surgery or something like that. No, that's not what it means. I've had students think that, but this was like far before. This was like in 1943 or something like that. So, but this means those who do not have that emotional part of the soul. And he says the operation of the Green Book and its kind, that is this elementary or high school textbook for English that was supposed to teach people English, but never got around to because it was proposed in philosophical theory insidiously. The operation of that, the purpose of it is to produce what may be called men without chest. And he says, it is an outrage that they should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. That is, these men without chests, right? Because it looks like they are so heady and so smart and so intellectual, right? I used to think this about philosophers, right? Maybe the stereotype still is pretty common that philosophers are just so in their head, and probably really true for the most part, honestly. The stereotype that they are so in their heads that they must be superior in intellect, right? So called intellectual. He says it's an outrage that they're commonly thought of because it gives them the chance to say that he who attacks them attacks intelligence. It is not so. They are not distinguished from other men by any unusual skill in finding truth, nor any virginal ardor to pursue truth. Indeed, it would be strange if people said that. And if they were distinguished by virginal ardor, what is ardor? That's love. That is a persevering devotion to truth. Devotion or love or ardor, right? And he says here, a nice sense of intellectual honor, perhaps as well, cannot be maintained without the aid of a sentiment, right? Again, Gayes and Titius, the whole idea of producing these men without chests is to produce people who who would do away with that emotion because you just repress that emotion. You don't need it. Just think intellect, right? So he's saying here it'd be ironic if you said these people were distinguished, or what makes them different is that they have a devotion to the truth, an intellectual. No. Devotion, love, honor, all these things are sentiments. So these won't be the things that mark them out. And those are sentiments which Gase and Tisch can debunk as easily as any other. So he says it's not an excess of thought that marks them out, but a defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks them out. He says their hearts are no bigger than the ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so, right? They don't have these big heads that are really, really smart, intellectual, and can, big, heady, nice, smart people. It's that they lack emotion, fertile emotion beneath them. So, all right, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to go to the chat now and ask, see if there are any questions in here. Okay, so think about it here. It says, thanks for being here and for your questions. So he says here, I'm a theist. I still believe in cultural relativism, and beauty being objective, even without God, makes zero sense. Why not? There's no cultural historical standard. And it's interesting to figure out what you mean more by this. Actually, let me put this. Let me take this down, and I'm just going to come to the middle now as I answer questions and we wrap up. So, excuse me. Got to get a better rolly situation here. All right, so I'm a theist. I believe in cultural relativism. Now, I believe in cultural relativism if it depends on what you mean by that. If you mean descriptive cultural relativism, the idea that you're not making any normative judgments or meta-ethical judgments. You're not saying that people should be relativists, but you're just looking out into the world and noticing that the people are relativistic in their thinking. That is what I take just cultural descriptive relativism to be. And if that's what you mean, absolutely that's true, because that just means that people think different things, that they disagree about moral systems and moral codes. That's all that means. And that they think that not only disagree, but they think that it's mind dependent. Right. So you could think that and still be a moral objectivist. So, yeah. Okay. What is Alex saying here? I know it's rare, but some people don't experience emotions, and some are very good at reading emotions and expressing them. That's true. It's unfortunate, but it's true. You might be thinking of autistic people. Now, I do wonder what Lewis would say about this new phenomenon, relatively new phenomenon. I mean, it's no secret that autistic individuals, at least autism as a disorder or as a phenomenon, people on the spectrum, that is a new thing, right? Just because the terminology is new, okay? It's not to say that we've never had autistic people ever in history. That's not true. Like, we have, right? But it was called different things as things, evolve and get called different things now. So if that's true, which I think it is, that there were autistic people back in history, we didn't call it that. I wonder what Lewis would say about those people, right? Being a value objectivist, he may have just said, well, there are certain goods and there are certain bads, and that also applies to the human individual. There can be a certain good way to be and a certain bad way to be. And I think that he'd say to be most completely human is to be someone who has well-formed emotions, right? And I think he could say that consistently and non-offensively, if that matters to you, and truthfully, that to be a full, well-rounded, holistic, well-formed human being is to be one with fertile emotion. Now, this gets into kind of my work on depression, right? Because I could say this about depression as well. It's like, to be a full, well-rounded, healthy, and full functioning and so on human being would be to be someone who doesn't have depression. Does that mean that people who have depression are morally bad? No, that's not what that means. That's not the conclusion you're trying to promote there. You're just saying that, in fact, you don't even need to commit yourself to saying that not being that would be a moral bad. Right. So You're just saying that it would just not be the ideal situation. That's all we're saying. And I think anybody who, even if you thought autism was good, you could probably even get on board with that and say that to not have fertile emotion and well-rounded emotional experiences could be a deficit. Like, it's not necessarily a moral bad, but it would be something, a lack, which you certainly could make up in other respects by other, either coping skills or other strengths in other areas. But it would certainly be something that would need to be made up for, right? So, I mean, that seems right to me. So, okay. So, think about this here. If God created a different world, would there be different notions of beauty? I don't think so, actually. And the reason why, well, I suppose it's epistemically possible, right? There are different notions of possibility, right? When we say that something's possible or not possible, right? If I say it's epistemically possible, I mean, for all I know, maybe, right? But if I don't, so in other words, I could be fallible about what I'm about to say next. Now, metaphysical possibility, again, I could be fallible here, could be wrong here. I don't think that it's possible if we grant that God is the standard for beauty, right? Because whatever God will create will then just be beautiful according to whatever he says is beautiful, right? That will just be the reference. So long as it's God creating this world or God creating another world, doesn't matter. Beauty in this world or that world will just have reference to the same God. So now it's interesting because, like, could God conceal his beauty or certainly or make certain standards or attributes of his beauty relevant in one world versus different standards of beauty relevant in a different world? Like, he could just conceal some of those standards for one world and reveal them in the next world. That's certainly possible as well. I don't even know what that would look like. I'm just like spitballing here. Think about logical space, but all right. Okay. Can God create a world? This is kind of a play off the last question where we all find feces beautiful, or is God subject to some laws of beauty that transcend him? Yeah. As I said before, like, if it were true that in this world God is concealing certain standards of beauty, like I said, and that in another world that he creates possibly not conceal those standards of beauties and reveal them, and that if those standards of beauty include feces being beautiful, perhaps. But a very big hurdle in this situation is not that he would conceal and then reveal. It's that we currently find something disgusting, and we're supposed to, in this new world, from the same author and creator, in this new world, find that not disgusting and now beautiful. That seems a direct contradiction, right? And so I'm not likely to find that possible or plausible. Yeah. So Alex says here, this is a side note, this is kind of off topic, but I'm glad you brought it up. So I've often wondered if Jesus was introvert, as he seemed to enjoy spending time alone. Yeah, certainly. I wonder that. Yeah, I can see why you would think that. And he certainly had like close, let's say, circles, right? So he had who was Peter, James, and John, who were in his inner circle of 3. And then he had his 12. And then he had certain other disciples, 12 apostles. And then he had certain disciples who, numbered in like the 60 or 50s or 60s or 40s or something like that, right? So he had different concentric circles of people around him. And I think that's really healthy, of course. And that's probably how most of us are. It's just like a human thing. But as far as like his behavior being introverted, maybe I'm not sure. But I think even an extrovert would say that it's probably a healthy thing to, at some points, have a period of recharge and rest, right? And certainly, like, even Catholics or Christians who are extroverts would say it's definitely a good thing to pray, right? So all that to say, I don't think just going alone by himself and praying marks him out necessarily as an introvert. He could very well have been an extrovert for all we know. Yeah. He spent 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. That's true. But notice that was a trial and a temptation, because it's not a vacation because I love being alone. You know what I mean? So, did Adam and Eve know of beauty before eating the apple? If we are to follow Christian theology on this, the idea that Adam and Eve would have been in God's presence, not perhaps completely unmitigated in God's glory, right? Because you still have the physical world here, and the angels probably, if we're to take the theological accounts of Christianity and the scriptures at face value here, the angels do have direct access to God and see him in his glory. They're praising him through all of eternity and without end. However, did Adam and Eve do that in their physical form, their physical bodies? No. So this leads me to think that they probably didn't have that unmitigated direct access to God, but they certainly had a kind of access to God that was clear and not marred by sin. So this would lead me to think that they did have maybe not a full and complete understanding of beauty, but certainly a much clearer understanding and direct access and appearance of beauty than we can probably see. So that's really a point. Yeah. So, all right, guys, this has been an amazing topic, and it's been a hit. We will wrap it up. And I really thank you for being here and for asking great questions. I really appreciate it. Like I said, this topic, it's kind of a novel thing because I'm trying to take a classroom lesson and apply it to this context, and it's not easy. Like ideally I'd like to have like a whiteboard here, and like actually write upon it and stuff. So got to do a little bit of things different, and just kind of weird and adapt them. And it's a slow going process and stuff, and technical difficulty and so on. So I appreciate you kind of sitting through that. So will I do the rest of the book? No, actually, I don't have plans for it. But if I do, the only reason I won't is because I only teach on chapter 1, and I certainly could in the future. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility. But I think the 3rd chapter is called The Abolition of Man, just what the book is called, and I don't even know what the 2nd chapter is called. I've got the whole thing, so I certainly could, but it would actually take some real study and thinking on my part to like take notes and to actually put it in a form that's digestible to you guys. So all that to say, like I'm just not the subject matter expert on those 2 other chapters. So if I were to do it, which is certainly possible, it would take me a lot of work to do. So I appreciate you guys being here, and I enjoyed it as well. Thank you for being here and enjoying it. They're much more interesting to non-believers, I would say. That's interesting. So I'm not familiar with them, but I will give them a look. I think I've got the book in print form somewhere in my library here, and I need to track it down and just do it. It's probably the best way forward is to do it just a little bit of leisure reading and then take notes and then be like, okay, I could form this into sort of a lecture. I think that's probably how this one started. Honestly, I've been doing it so long, I don't even know how it got started. Like how I first started teaching on this. Or it could have been that I inherited it from a professor that I TA'd for or something like that. So I couldn't even tell you. But yeah, so if you're right about this, it's much more interesting than non-believers. I'm interested to see what they would say actually. So I will give it a look. All right, cool. Well, guys, it's been really, really terrific. And you're right, Mary, that Jesus is probably far more balanced than any of us. That's absolutely true. Of course, it takes like a certain assumption to express that truth, but you're certainly right. I share that assumption, and it's absolutely true. But talking to people who are not sharing that same assumption, it's a bit difficult to be like, oh, by the way, don't you know Jesus is perfect and blah, blah, blah. And they're just not going to share that same assumption with me, but you're absolutely right. Well, guys, that's it for us today. Be here. Let me show you here real quick. If you have not seen it already, then not Thursday. On Wednesday, kind of a normal office hours time, as you can see here, this is the one we're in currently, Man Without Chest. We have a new office hours call in. So if you have any kind of lingering questions about this topic, please meet me and ask about those things then. And then, of course, here is that other C.S. Lewis piece, 3 Parts of Morality. I'm excited about that one. And this is really foundational for any other lecture I'm ever going to do, because I'll probably guide you through, after doing today and after doing this one, I'll probably guide you through kind of my whole syllabus on Intro to Ethics. And we'll go through different ethical theories, normative ethical theories. We'll go through a section on law and community, talk about the classical authors, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas, and then probably get around to like virtue ethics as well, in particular, like at least like applied virtue ethics. And if you find that any of that interesting, or if you want to suggest any other topics that I may teach on or may have taught on, then certainly don't hesitate to pull those up. Yeah. 4:30 p.m., which time tonight is going to be Eastern time every week. And that's a standing appointment. So, all right, guys, that is it for us. Thanks for sharing your lectures with us. Yeah, no problem. I appreciate you guys enjoying it. That's why I'm doing it. And that's actually why I started this channel. And I kind of gotten away from my class lectures, and I want to get back around to that. So I appreciate that there's an actual audience for you guys. So thank you to you for being here and enjoying them. So, all right, guys. So I'll really wrap it up now, and it's been great. So I will see you in the next one on Wednesday. All right, take care. God bless. Bye.